Hey there, it's Silver. This is Smalland, Survive the Wild. So this is a survival game, part of that, what I'm calling the third wave of survival games, if that makes sense, because, you had your first wave, which were the ones that initially got popular, like your DayZ and things like that, and then you had, after that, your second wave with games like Subnautica and other games trying some different ideas and sort of expanding in various directions, and now we're on sort of the third wave of survival games where we're polishing up a lot of those ideas and trying all sorts of new things, and this is where the genre has actually become a lot more interesting to me because when survival games first started out, I wasn't hugely into them. There were only a couple that I really enjoyed, but then when games like Subnautica and some other games like that came out, I really enjoyed those. So now that we're seeing this newer wave of survival games that are taking lessons from that second wave and then sort of applying them in other directions, this is where it gets really interesting for me, and that's why I've been covering several of them so far. Games like Fountain of Youth and V Rising, for instance. So this is another one of those, and the conceit here is that you are a member of a race called the small folk, and unsurprisingly, that means you are very, very small. So small, in fact, that the usual stuff that would bother you in a survival game isn't really the point here. Instead, most of your enemies are things like insects, because you are roughly the size of a bottle cap or a ladybug or something around that size, so small things like beetles and butterflies and all of those sorts of things look huge to you. And the main idea here is actually, this is a bit more of a story-driven survival game, which we're seeing more of in this third wave, where it's not just pure sandbox anymore, and instead a lot of them want to have more of a narratively driven experience, along with the ability to still sandbox whenever you want, and this game is definitely going for that. So you are not the only living thing in this world, or at least the only non-hostile living thing. There are plenty of NPCs along the way, and of course it is also multiplayer. And these NPCs will have all sorts of quests for you to do, from side stuff just to help you get started, to the actual main quest line that is mostly about figuring out what's going on in this forest, why the animals are getting more aggressive, and what's actually changing. And of course you will be building some homes to live in and exploring the area, uncovering secrets, and harvesting lots and lots of various materials and stuff to get yourself started. As far as pure survival mechanics goes, it is pretty standard. You've got your health gauge, and you've also got a nourishment gauge. You do not have a hunger and thirst separate gauge, you just have nourishment, which goes up if you eat or drink, which is nice. And the gauge actually depletes relatively quickly, which normally I would have a problem with. I often don't like it in survival games when your hunger gauge goes down too fast. But in this game, I think it actually manages to make it not a problem, really, because even the most simple things you can cook restore quite a lot of the gauge, like 30% of it or so, just from one thing. And also, every prepared or cooked piece of food gives you the full stomach buff, which makes it to where your nourishment doesn't decrease for a certain amount of time. And more advanced dishes both give you more nourishment and make this buff last longer. So the fact that you can actually build your hunger gauge back up pretty easily, and you can prevent it from draining for a while, means I don't actually mind the gauge draining relatively quickly outside of that, because it helps to keep the challenge up while also not making it like a babysitting the gauge simulator like some early survival games had, where the gauge is just depleted too fast and you never had the time to do anything other than keep them full. This actually, I think, has enough methods to counteract the draining of the gauge that it is a good mechanic, not annoying, not an obnoxious problem. It's a fair implementation of a hunger and thirst system, I think. There's also a temperature gauge. This won't be relevant at first because you're going to be in a pretty mild sort of forested area, but of course as you explore around and find new biomes and things, you can get extremely hot or extremely cold, and you'll need to dress appropriately. Different armor sets will give you different benefits in terms of, what sorts of environment you can survive. So if you're going for more of the extreme biomes, then yeah, you're going to need to pre-prepare in order to get the right clothing and stuff to make sure you can actually live. The clothing, by the way, is something I want to mention because the game has kind of a cool mechanic surrounding its armors. So the armor sets in this game are a pretty big deal because they tend to give you very significant stat boosts and stuff. So getting a new armor set is like a really large increase in your power. It's almost like leveling up in a more traditional RPG. As you go through the various material tiers and all that stuff and you craft yourself some new armor, you're going to feel immediately more powerful every time you get a new set, which is cool. It gives you something to work towards at all times. But it's not just that the armors are very powerful in this game, it's how they're actually crafted. In a lot of these games, you get the armor recipes when you get a material. So, the first time you mine iron or the first time you craft an iron ingot, you'll learn how to make iron armor from that or something like that. But in this case, you actually don't naturally learn armor just from gathering materials. And instead, you actually have to find NPCs and request that they craft armor for you. Now, you can still craft the armor yourself once you know the recipe for it, but you have to do this first in order to get them to teach you the recipe. So this means that every new armor crafting NPC will have at least one, sometimes two new armor sets that you can learn from them just by talking to them. So this is a way to encourage you to explore the world, because instead of being worried about gathering a specific tier of resource or something like that, you're worried about finding new people to talk to, because they'll teach you the stuff that you need to know to survive. And I think that's a really cool idea. You know, having these armor sets be things that you have to specifically learn how to craft from the experts, and then once you go out and find them, you can then go take the recipes home and make them yourself if you want, or have that person craft them, whatever. It seems to cost the same amount of resources no matter what, so it doesn't really matter, you just have to learn them first. And I like the idea of needing to explore to learn. And then as you learn, you of course can explore farther, because like I mentioned, each armor is a very significant increase in your potential, so exploring is a really big deal in this game. House building is also, of course, a mechanic that is pretty common with these sorts of games, and in this case it works a lot like Valheim's house building a little bit. There's even like a, you can only build so far up depending on the material you're using system. So you first start out with just like some plant fiber grassy stuff. This is, your weakest building material, but it is the most plentiful at first, so you'll build a basic house out of it just to get yourself started, and then eventually you'll learn how to make some wood materials, and then after that some stone and some things like that. So as you go up the material tiers, your houses can get more and more elaborate, because each one can support more weight farther off the ground and farther away from walls and stuff. So you have to worry about making like load-bearing walls to ensure that the ceilings can actually cover everything, and that a roof can stretch across the whole house and stuff like that. It's a fun building system, and it's not finicky or anything. The controls seem well implemented, and the snapping is also well done, so that it snaps exactly how you want it to, or you can turn that off if you want to freehand some stuff as well. So I think it's a pretty good building system. I haven't had any problems with it so far, and I've been able to build pretty much everything I've wanted. Like whenever I've tried to build a house and had an idea of what I wanted it to look like, I've been able to actually achieve that. So that must mean the controls are at least good enough to not have to fight with them. They seem to be pretty well implemented. One thing the building does a little bit different is the idea of needing a roof. Not just because you get the sheltered buff when you have a roof over your head, but also because the weather can actually damage your structures, especially if it storms. You can have your structures get damaged and need to repair them with your repair hammer. But if you have a roof, then your floors and walls are protected and won't be damaged by storms and things, and you'll just have to worry about making sure the roof stays in good condition instead. So you are encouraged to actually build complete houses and not just like buckets to live in, because you need that roof in order to actually make the whole thing stand up to nasty weather. Crafting is, of course, another big important part of any of these games, and the crafting system, I think, works pretty well. It's very station-based, so we're looking at, every different material type has its own set of stations that you need for it. So at first you'll just have a basic workbench for your easier stuff, and of course a couple of things you can craft by hand as well, like torches and some basic tools. And then eventually you'll get stuff like a stone cutter and like an apothecary table and all those various things that expand outwards, and as you get more and more rare and exotic materials, you can find different stations to actually utilize those materials. You have to do a lot of refining of stuff. So, like, you'll get herptile hide from killing lizards and stuff like that pretty easily, but you won't be able to really use the hide for much, but eventually you'll be able to build a tannery station so you can turn that hide into leather, and then you can actually use that leather in lots of different armor crafting recipes and stuff. So the game does have a good mixture of your sort of material-based crafting stations and also your, like, refining gameplay that is pretty common, I think, in the survival games right now, where you get a lot of raw materials, but you can't just use the raw materials as they are. Instead, you have a sort of supply line of different stations that can craft them into more usable things, and then you use those things on their own stations in order to actually craft stuff you need. You're also encouraged to just explore around and smack whatever you find, because whenever you pick up a new material, you will get some basic new recipes for that material. So you're encouraged to just pick as many new things up as possible to unlock more stuff that you can actually do with it. And of course, if you unlock a new station, then whenever you actually craft that station and place it in your house for the first time, you'll unlock a bunch of new blueprints that way as well. So your blueprint collection will expand both from exploration in terms of killing new enemies to get their new materials, harvesting new materials, and talking to new NPCs for armor blueprints, and in terms of actually building new milestone stations in your house in order to unlock more refinements and better gear and stuff. There is a leveling system, by the way, but it's pretty basic. I'm not sure if they're going to do anything more with it yet or not, but right now there isn't like a talent tree or anything like that. It's just a simple experience bar, and every time it fills up by killing enemies, and also you get some experience by harvesting stuff, which I do approve of. then you will gain a level. And when you gain a level, you'll get 3 attribute points that you can put into one of 4 different attributes. You got your strength, your speed, as well as maximum health and maximum stamina. And strength is arguably the most important one because this game has a lot of combat in it. You do need to do combat pretty often because there are lots of materials that you'll need for various things that you can only get from killing enemies. But also, the strength doesn't only increase your damage against enemies, it also increases your damage against resource nodes. So with higher strength, you'll also be able to mine stuff faster and things like that. I think honestly the game's biggest strength is its environment and its atmosphere. The world looks a lot different when you're this small, and areas can have a very different atmosphere to them when you're this small. You know, a cave full of spiders is not an uncommon fantasy setting. You see them pretty often, but a cave full of spiders in this game feels a little bit different than one of the traditional fantasy ones because you're tiny. And it also affects very much how you will be exploring these areas. And on the topic of exploration, by the way, this game has a bit of an unexpected turn to it in that it's actually post-apocalyptic, which it doesn't look like at first. It looks very fantasy-esque, very like Fae themed. And you are definitely like a Fae creature, but this takes place in the modern day. You'll start to see signs of modern humans, like some discarded car key fobs and some old walkie-talkies lying around and some traffic cones and stuff like that, and you'll realize this is actually taking place in the modern day, and you're in a place where civilization was. And you find out eventually from some NPCs that the giants, which is the small folk word for humans, used to live here, but then they all suddenly disappeared and no one knows why. So basically this is a take on the post-apocalyptic setting, but done very, very differently from how it usually is. And I personally really appreciate that because it means that, you know, exploring the ruins of human civilization is not a rare thing in a survival game. There have been many games that have done that, but none of them have done it like this, as far as I know, and this doesn't feel like any of the others. You know, this isn't zombie survival or nuclear post-apocalypse or anything like that. This is something very different. It's actually a very lush landscape, and you're these kind of crazy fantasy Fae creatures. So it becomes really interesting when you suddenly come across like a destroyed roadway with old rusted out cars that you can explore like mountains because they're so huge compared to you. And you eventually will get to stuff like tombs, I've heard, and some other things like that that could have some really interesting implications for figuring out what happened, as well as just having some really neat atmosphere because a lot of these contemporary fantasy areas have a very different feel when you have to explore them as an extremely tiny creature. And I think it's really neat how far they've gone with it. They've even made a lot of your resource gathering themed around how small you are. Like, you know, in a normal survival game, one of the first things you do is chop down trees to get logs, but in this game, you can't chop down a tree because they're massive compared to you. It would take like 600 years. So instead, you actually have to mine pieces of bark with a pickaxe, and that actually gets you your sort of lumber resource. And instead of mining iron ore in the cave wall or something like that, you actually have to find old like scrap gears and stuff lying around and mine those for metal shards and melt that down into iron instead of using ore. And you can also find things like old discarded screws and bottle caps that are made of metal. So it's nice how all-encompassing the theme is. It's not just you're small. Like, they've thought very heavily on how the world needs to be designed and how the resource gathering needs to be designed and all that stuff in order to really drive home how being this small affects the normal survival game stuff and changes them and kind of tips them on their head a little bit. And I appreciate how far they've gone in that regard. Also, I haven't done it yet, but you can tame creatures, which is pretty cool too. You can ride bugs and things like that. If you have the right treats, which you'll eventually get recipes for as you explore around and stuff, you can damage an enemy down to like critical health and then feed them a treat and actually tame them. And you can then feed them other food in order to keep them healed up, and you can actually ride them around. And I believe you can even get flying mounts this way, like butterflies and moths and stuff. So that's a pretty cool feature. I'm definitely a fan of that. I haven't been able to experiment much with it yet, but I definitely do want to actually try because jumping around on a grasshopper or riding around on like a gecko or something sounds like a lot of fun. It's definitely a cool feature to have, and I think that's another good example of how being super miniature affects the world, because of course navigating a world when you're this tiny is very difficult because even small inclines can be like large mountains to you, and you can't just walk everywhere because everything is very mountainous in comparison to how small you are. So having insectile help that allows you to crawl around or even fly around is a pretty good idea, I think. And lastly, in terms of the early access, this is actually one of the most polished of the early access survival games I've played. All of the content currently on offer feels very polished so far. I haven't encountered any major bugs except for the ones that try to eat you. And of all of the small bugs I've encountered, there have only been a couple, and they've been very minor, like one enemy's AI breaking and sticking them in a wall. and that's about it. Like, I haven't really encountered much in terms of jank or instability or anything like that. The game's never crashed on me or anything. So I think that in terms of polish, the game has got quite a focus, I think, on pushing updates that are full of polish and not just pushing tons of content to say they have it. So I think it's in a really good state right now, and I think that the future plans for what updates are going to contain are also exciting, because the game experience itself, as it currently stands, is very good and actually really fun to engage with. So seeing it continue to expand and get more polish and more content and more features is definitely something to look forward to. So I will put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page to Smalland. Please note that, of course, this video was only just scratching the surface on what's possible in a large-scale survival game like this, and it is, I'm sure, very fun in multiplayer as well. So thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.